The wind tearing across the prairie outside Willow Springs on the morning of January 7th, 1878, carried the bite of oncoming snow and the warning of a winter that would grind every living soul down to the bone. Willow Springs, nothing more than a wind-blown speck in Wyoming Territory. A day's ride north of the Union Pacific line, out of Cheyenne, felt like the kind of place where cold could slip through any seam in a man's coat and settle deep until it felt like part of his ribs. The river crawled slow and black between frozen banks, its surface cluttered with slabs of ice that groaned under their own weight. Along the western cottonwoods, about a quarter-mile from the scattered buildings of town, a half-circle of Apache lodges braced against the iron-colored sky. Their buffalo hides were patched smoke-darkened at the top, and the thin streams drifting upward were snatched away by the wind before they ever rose clear. At the camp's edge, pressed tight against the timber, as though ashamed to be seen, stood a rough log cabin. Thrown together from green wood, and chinked with moss and frozen mud, it already showed the cracks of hard weather. The roof sagged under a layer of sod, and the single window. Nothing but oiled paper rattled miserably each time a gust slapped against it. The door hung uneven on leather hinges, leaving a gap wide enough for cold air or field mice to slip through. The place sat on a sliver of treaty ground land that belonged to everyone only because it belonged to no one at all. And in the trampled snow between that lonely cabin and the edge of Willow Springs, 3 figures stood locked in a scene folks would be discussing around saloon tables and stove tops for weeks. The first was Iron Wolf, an Apache warrior of 25 winters, lean as a hunting wolf and twice as watchful. He wore a smoke-stained buckskin shirt fringed at the shoulders, marked with blue trade beads his mother had sewn on before fever stole her 3 years prior. His hair fell in 2 tight braids, wrapped with red cloth, and a heavy Canadian wool blanket lay across his shoulders, one fair and square in a summer horse race before treaties began closing in on his people. His face was sharp-boned, unreadable, the kind built by years of learning never to offer a white man more than necessary. Resting on his open palm was a single silver dollar, catching the weak winter light cold and bright. Facing him stood Rudd Malloy, known from freight roads to saloon corners as Muddy Boots, thanks to the trail grime permanently stained into his vest, trousers, and cracked leather boots. Rudd was a big man who'd grown soft in the middle with a face like sun-cured pork, greasy red and cross-hatched with old scars from fights he bragged about once whiskey loosened his tongue. His hands were thick nails blackened with dirt that never truly came off, and his eyes were small, mean, and set too close together. He waved a folded slip of paper as if it were a winning hand. Beside him, shivering in a dress the color of dirty dishwater, stood a young woman. Her name was Mara Keene, though most in Willow Springs only called her the deaf girl when they bothered calling her anything at all. She looked no more than 20, pale, hollow-cheeked, worn thin by too many nights without food, or hope to fill her out again. Her hair, the washed-out yellow of winter straw, was pulled into a severe braid that hung limp down her back. Her eyes were faded blue, staring straight ahead, seeing everything, yet giving nothing away. Her hands red and raw with small burns, and cuts from endless chores hung at her sides. She did not look at Iron Wolf. She did not look at Rudd Malloy. She stared at the crushed snow, waiting for whatever came next. A small crowd had gathered, teamsters stamping their feet, ranch hands blowing into their palms, townsmen looking for anything to break winter boredom. And leaning against the hitching post outside the general store, arms folded over his chest so his tin star caught the light, stood Varn Pike, the marshal of Willow Springs. Tall, narrow-hipped, and sharp-faced like a hatchet blade, Pike had the eyes of a man who measured everything. Danger and opportunity in equal parts. After 3 years wearing the badge, he'd learned the law could be whatever a man with a gun said it was, provided he said it loud enough. He watched Iron Wolf the way a man watches a rattler curled too close to his boot, careful, calculating, and ready to strike first. And standing off to the side near the blacksmith shop was a drifter they called Rafe Thorne. Rafe wore a patched long coat, carried a revolver on each hip, and had a scarred face with eyes like dead coals. Folks whispered he'd ridden with outlaw gangs in Kansas and Missouri, had killed 3 men in fair fights, maybe more from behind. He watched the exchange with a predator's patience, calculating value the way others measured cattle. His gaze drifted to the money pouch hanging on Rudd Malloy's belt, the one clearly bulging with coin. His tongue flicked across his lower lip once, like a man already imagining what might soon be his. Then Rudd raised his voice, not because Mara couldn't hear, though most believed that, but because he wanted every soul in that frozen yard to remember his words. "This girl owes me passage from New York Harbor," he barked, tapping the contract. "Boots feed a roof when it rained, and for dragging her sorry hide halfway across this country. She signed her mark, and she can't pay or work it off. So the debt passes legal and proper. I've got the contract right here, signed proper and stamped." Rudd Malloy crowed, shaking the paper like proof of his righteousness. "She scratched her mark on it herself, or as close to a mark as you'll get from a mute girl who can't hear thunder. She can't pay what she owes, and she can't work it off neither, seeing as she's stone deaf and simple besides." He slapped the folded contract with his thumb. "So the debt moves on with the county seal behind it. You take her and the paper both, and I wipe my hands clean of this whole cursed problem." Iron Wolf didn't answer. The wind tugged at his blanket, whispering through dry grass poking up from the snow. His gaze shifted from the contract to Mara Keene's bowed head, to the lone cabin sitting on the sliver of treaty ground the Apache were permitted to use, land he knew wouldn't stay theirs. Once spring thawed the promises white men always broke. Silence stretched long enough for the crowd to grow restless, boots, shifting glances traded. Then Iron Wolf stepped forward, steady as a man testing river ice he doesn't trust, and set the silver dollar into Rudd Malloy's waiting palm. The coin gave a soft, cold clink against those thick calluses. Rudd's grin split wide, yellow teeth flashing like a stray dog's. With theatrical flair, he offered the folded contract, as though gifting the deed to a gold mine rather than a woman's life. Iron Wolf took the paper and without a flicker of emotion tore it straight down the middle. The parchment ripped sharp and final, a sound that cut through the winter air like a bullet. The pieces fluttered down into the churned snow at Rudd's boots. "She owes you nothing," Iron Wolf said in slow, precise English. "The debt is done." Rudd's grin curdled into something meaner. He lunged to gather the scraps, muttering curses, but Iron Wolf had already turned away, walking toward the cabin. He didn't touch Mara, didn't speak to her, just lifted his chin in a silent signal that meant, "Follow if you want to live." She obeyed, stiff and aching, like a woman whose bones had been rusted by too many hard months. The onlookers murmured uneasily. Varn Pike straightened at the hitching post, his eyes narrowing to razor-thin slits. Rafe Thorne watched with deadened curiosity, and when Rudd shoved the torn paper into his coat, patting the money pouch at his belt to reassure himself, it drew Rafe's gaze like blood draws a hawk. A faint smile ghosted across his scarred face before he pushed off the wall and drifted toward the Lucky Dollar Saloon, already counting someone else's money in his head. Inside the small cabin, Mara pressed her back to the door, arms wrapped tight, as if she could hold herself together by force alone. The room was dim and cold, washed in the pale light, leaking through the oiled paper window and the dull red glow of a stubborn iron stove. Smoke seeped from gaps where the stovepipe met a rough-cut hole in the roof, curling into sickly spirals before slipping back down in a draft. Iron Wolf shut the door, dropped the heavy bar across it, and crouched beside the stove, studying it with the practiced eye of a man who'd survived winters meant to kill the unprepared. "This fire's set wrong," he muttered to himself. "If we don't fix it, this place burns before dawn, or we choke out in our sleep." Mara lifted her head, watching his mouth carefully. She hesitated, then nodded once. "You understand me?" Iron Wolf asked. It wasn't a question. She held his gaze, then nodded again. "Good," he said. "Then help me fix it before we freeze or burn." Iron Wolf was no green scout, The scars along his ribs and the puckered bullet mark on his shoulder were reminders of the summer he'd ridden, the Blue Rock Plains where raiding parties and cavalry patrols stalked the same tall grass like hungry wolves. He'd learned early that treaties were words on paper, and paper burned faster than dry sage. This cabin and the scrap of treaty ground beneath it had come from a bargain struck last October. The government agent Mercer, a rat-faced man who smiled too easily and stank of sour whiskey, had come to the Apache winter camp, promising rations and permission to stay near Willow Springs, so long as they didn't interfere with railroad survey crews. A thin deal, but winter killed quicker than bullets. Mara's road west had been paved with lies. She'd traveled in a freight wagon full of women, with nowhere else to go. She was meant to marry a German farmer, Elias Bauer, who held title to good meadowland 2 days north. Before she ever left Hamburg, Elias had arranged a proxy marriage, legally binding them. If he died, she would inherit his land. He had died on November 9, 1877, just 23 days before she arrived in Willow Springs. A mine tunnel collapsed at Cinder Bluff, burying him under a mountain of rock. Rudd Malloy had been hired to haul Elias's trunk back to town. He'd picked the lock on the way, prying it open where no one could see. Inside the trunk, tucked between worn clothing and seed catalogs, Rudd Malloy had discovered the proxy marriage papers dated March 14, 1877, along with a homestead patent, approved on April 2nd of the same year. He knew instantly what those documents meant. If Mara Keene ever claimed the land, she would hold Rich Bottom, ground lying square in the path of the coming railroad, property worth a fortune. But if she stayed unaware, he could take it. So Rudd Malloy lied. He told her Elias Bauer had died without a single legal paper to his name. He made her sign a receipt in English she barely understood, then twisted it into an indenture contract. The marriage certificate and the land patent he hid in a strongbox beneath the floorboards of his office. Mara's hearing had been damaged by scarlet fever at 7. She could catch loud sounds, a gunshot, a shout, but voices blurred together. She had taught herself to read lips, piecing meaning together like scraps of cloth. When she once replied too quickly, Rudd beat her and spread the lie that she was deaf and simple. Being thought useless kept most men's hands off her. Iron Wolf had begun to suspect the truth 6 days before the silver dollar exchange. He'd seen her sidestep a panicked horse with perfect timing. No fully deaf woman could react like that. Now as they worked shoulder to shoulder to fix the crooked stovepipe, steadying the hot metal wedging stones beneath it, moving in tight unison to keep from burning the place down, a first fragile closeness formed between them, born from the simple need to stay alive. Through the next 10 days, from January 7th to 16th, a quiet routine settled in. Mara learned to haul water, tend the coals, and move softly around the Apache camp. Iron Wolf's cousin Sala, a fierce woman who had lost her husband Graythorn to pneumonia last winter, showed her how to stack wood and scrape hides. Sala had no time for white folks' troubles, but she respected skill, and Mara worked hard enough to earn it. In town, Rudd Malloy brooded into his whiskey. Varn Pike watched with a calculating stare. Rafe Thorne watched, both sensing profit in the air. He had a talent for slipping into doorways when men counted cash, for lingering near talk of locked boxes and hidden bookkeeping. He never asked questions. He simply observed, stored things away, and waited. On January 11th, Iron Wolf tested Mara. Inside the general store, he let a horseshoe fall. It struck the wooden floor with a bright metallic ring. Mara flinched too fast to hide. That night across the small table, Iron Wolf spoke carefully. "You hear some things. Not everything, but enough." After a long quiet, Mara rasped, "Why did you let them believe I was deaf?" She stared at her scarred hands. "Rudd beat me for replying too quick," once she said. "After that, I stayed quiet. Men ignore what they think is broken." "You're not broken," he said. Her expression sharpened, cold, fierce. "No, but pretending kept me alive. Then tell me what you know." Over several nights, Mara told him everything. She described crouching inside Rudd's barn, her ear pressed to gaps in the boards, listening as Rudd Malloy, Varn Pike, and Mercer argued over stolen government shipments. A ledger kept record amounts, listed amounts delivered. Never the same. They sold what they skimmed and split the gold. Pike wanted to burn the ledger, Mara whispered. Rudd refused. He said it was his protection. If Pike killed him, the book would go to Washington. No honor among thieves, Marshal, she repeated bitterly. Iron Wolf asked, Where is it? Under his office floor. In a strong box. She pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket, a torn corner, showing part of the name, Elias Bauer, and the date March 14th, 187. I found it in the ash bucket, she said. Rudd burns papers. This piece escaped. Iron Wolf understood. Then Mara wasn't only trapped in debt, she was a threat to a land grab worth thousands. The marriage papers and the ledger were both in the same strongbox. He made his decision. We take it, he said. We bring it to someone who can use it. Rudd will kill us. He'll try. Iron Wolf knew only one person with enough grit to help Doc Avery, a sharp-tongued widow in her mid-40s, with iron-gray hair and the spine of a railroad spike. She'd come west after cholera took her husband, armed only with her medical kit and a refusal to tolerate fools. She treated anyone who could pay and many who couldn't. She had set bones for Apache children when other doctors looked away. On January 16th, Iron Wolf found her in her clinic. The room smelled of carbolic acid and old blood. She was stitching up Tate, a ranch hand who'd torn himself on barbed wire. When Tate limped out, she fixed Iron Wolf with a hard stare. You look like a man dragging trouble behind him, she said. He told her everything. Doc Avery cleaned her instruments in practiced efficient motions, never interrupting. When he finished, she gave a thin, predatory smile. About damn time somebody stood up to those vultures. Then she laid out a plan. On January 19th, Iron Wolf would ride into Willow Springs, trading hides in plain sight. While he occupied watchful eyes, Mara Keene was to slip into Rudd Malloy's office through a loosened board, steal the ledger and the hidden papers, then deliver them straight to Doc Avery. Doc would copy the incriminating pages and telegraph a federal judge in Tombstone Ridge, Judge Sterling, a man who owed her more than one favor. It's dangerous, Doc Avery warned, fixing Mara with a sharp, knowing stare. If Rudd catches you, he'll kill you. I know, Mara said quietly. I'm done being afraid. Doc Avery nodded once. Then we move in 3 days. But trouble had a way of multiplying. One complication came in the form of Bram, a 19-year-old blacksmith's apprentice from Bavaria, slight, lonely, dark-haired. He had made 2 visits to the Apache camp, repairing tools, speaking soft German to Mara, slipping her bread when he thought no one noticed. He admired Iron Wolf's quiet steadiness and foolishly, dangerously had begun to imagine he might belong somewhere. On the night of January 17th, Varn Pike cornered Bram in the smithy. He shut the door, sealing them in. A single rifle cartridge clicked against the anvil, a sound that hung in the shadows like a threat. You've spent time with the Indians, Pike murmured, voice low and poisonous. I only do work for them. Honest work, Bram stammered. You know what happens to foreigners who choose wrong. Pike leaned in, close breath, sour and hot. Committees drag 'em to a rope and a tree. You're here because we let you be here. Then Pike gave orders. Watch the Apache warrior. Report anything unusual. And when the time came, lead Pike's men to the camp. You do that, you stay alive, Pike said, tapping the cartridge with a yellowed nail. You cross me, you hang. Bram nodded, pale, trembling fear clawing at his gut, while his conscience fought to breathe. The theft was set for Wednesday afternoon, January 19th. The cold had deepened sky, thick with the promise of snow. Iron Wolf rode into Willow Springs, just past noon, on a paint pony, leading a pack horse, heavy with hides and venison. He strode openly into the general store, asking loud questions about coffee and ammunition, making certain everyone noticed him. Across the street, Mara Keene slipped behind the freight yard wrapped in a dark shawl, moving like someone used to being overlooked. She counted her steps, stopped at the third window. The board covering it hung from a single bent nail loosened weeks earlier. She pried it free, squeezed through the narrow opening, and dropped into Rudd Malloy's office. The room smelled of stale smoke and whiskey. Her pulse hammered so fiercely she thought the walls might echo it. She forced slow breaths, moved to the corner where a loose floorboard bore a knot shaped like a teardrop. She eased it up. The strong box waited beneath. She jammed a bent nail into the padlock and twisted. Click. The lock surrendered. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the ledger, thick, leather-bound, damning. She opened it just enough to glimpse columns of stolen shipments. Tucked behind it were the proxy marriage certificate and the homestead patent. She stuffed everything into a cloth sack and turned toward the window. The door exploded inward. Rudd Malloy filled the frame, shotgun leveled. "That ledger's my protection, girl. You think I'm letting you walk out with my neck in a bag?" He lifted the shotgun, finger tightening. Across the street, Iron Wolf caught sudden movement through the grimy glass. Two figures, one large, one small, and the unmistakable rise of a shotgun. Instinct hit him like a lightning bolt. He dropped the bundle of hides, ignored Mr. Kell's startled shout, and tore across the muddy street. A freight wagon skidded, the driver cursing, but Iron Wolf didn't slow. He smashed into the office door, splintering the latch, throwing himself forward just as Rudd's finger committed. The shotgun roared like thunder in a wooden coffin. The blast tore through the ceiling, spraying splinters and mouse nests down like filthy snow. Iron Wolf drove his shoulder into Rudd Malloy's ribs, slamming him backward. The impact jolted Rudd's grip, firing the second barrel into the floorboards. A fist-sized hole blew open, filling the room with acrid smoke. A kerosene lantern, jarred loose by the explosion, crashed to the floor. Burning oil spread hungrily. Flames licking upward, catching on an oiled cloth. Mara did not freeze. She kicked the flaming cloth down, stomping it again and again, even as sparks bit through her boot. Smoke stung her eyes, but she didn't stop until the fire died to a smolder. Outside, Cutter Joe, a half-drunk teamster with a milky eye and a mean streak, raised a rifle through the shattered window. Mara saw the movement, the glint of steel. She threw herself sideways, slamming into Iron Wolf with all her weight. The rifle cracked like a whip, the shot slicing past Iron Wolf's head by inches before smashing into the telegraph sounder on the desk, spraying sparks and twisted brass across the room. Across the street, Doc Avery, pretending to browse for supplies, stepped into the doorway the instant she heard the blast. Her eyes swept the scene in a single practiced glance. Rudd Malloy, sprawled on the floor, wheezing. Mara Keene, clutching the cloth sack. Cutter Joe ramming another round into his rifle, and she moved with a surgeon's precision. She stepped through the broken glass, and as Varn Pike barreled down the street, shouting threats, Doc Avery casually braced a hand on the doorframe and hooked the sack with her boot. A heartbeat later, she walked away calm as iced water, the ledger and marriage papers hidden beneath the heavy folds of her skirt. By the time Pike stormed into the office, revolver drawn, eyes wild, the evidence had vanished. That night, January 19th, Rudd Malloy and Pike drowned themselves in whiskey in the back room of the Lucky Dollar. The air hung thick with cigar smoke and rage. Out front, Rafe Thorne sat alone, nursing a bottle of cheap corn whiskey, positioned just close enough to the thin wall to catch every word. "If that ledger reaches a judge, we swing." Pike rasped his bandaged hand, shaking as he poured another drink. "Mercer will run for the hills, but us, we're done." "You think I don't know that?" Rudd snarled, slamming his glass so hard it cracked. "You wanted it burned months ago. I kept it because the minute I didn't have leverage, you'd put a bullet in my spine. And now the damn thing will kill us both." Pike's face tightened like a block of stone. "We're hitting that Apache camp tonight. We grab the girl, get the ledger, and burn the place to cinders. No witnesses. No evidence. I'll get men. Through the wall, Rafe Thorne's smile spread slow and thin. He'd been waiting for this, waiting for the moment desperate men stopped thinking and started dying. He knew Pike kept a roll of emergency cash in his vest, skimmed from backroom punishments and crooked fines. He knew Rudd Malloy carried his cut of the stolen profits in a leather pouch on his belt, trusting no one enough to hide it elsewhere. When the firestorm hit, and it would, Rafe Thorne planned to walk away heavier in the pockets. Loyalty, he'd learned long ago, was just the price a man hadn't been offered yet. Pike gathered his crew by midnight, Cutter Joe bruised and itching to settle a score. Bolt and Smythe both owing Pike money they couldn't repay. Rafe Thorne, who joined for $2 a bottle and his own reasons. And Bram dragged from his cot behind the smithy, terrified and shaking. Pike jammed a revolver against the boy's temple hard enough to leave a ring-shaped bruise. "You're gonna lead us to that cabin," Pike growled. "You keep your mouth shut. You do exactly what I tell you, or I blow your brains out right here and tell the town you tried to rob me." Bram went pale as a ghost, his hands shaking. He thought of Mara Keene's worn face when he'd slipped her bread, the way she'd thanked him softly in their shared language. He thought of the Apache children who watched him work with wide, curious eyes. And he thought of the rope. "I understand," he whispered. They rode out at midnight on January 20th, a storm gathering on the northern rim like a wall of hammered iron. At the Apache camp, Sala was checking the horses when she spotted the tracks, boot prints, not moccasins. Horses shod with iron. 5, maybe 6 riders coming straight from town. Fresh, less than an hour old. She ran back and found Iron Wolf splitting wood near the cabin. "Riders coming," she said in rapid Apache breath, turning to steam. "White men!" "5 or more. Close." Iron Wolf set the axe aside, fingers brushing the knife at his belt. He stared toward the tree line, listening. The wind was rising thick with the smell of snow. "Bring the children inside," he told her. "Graythorn. Doc Avery if she's here. Anyone who can't fight." Sala's eyes flashed rage, simmering. "This is your battle. Your white woman brought danger to our doorstep. Why risk our children?" "Because they will not stop with her," Iron Wolf said quietly, meeting her glare without flinching. "They want us gone. The land, the rations, everything. If we don't stand now, they'll kill us in pieces." Sala held his gaze for a long, hard moment, then gave one sharp nod. "Then we stand. But if we lose people tonight, their blood is on you." "I know," Iron Wolf said, "and I'll bear it." The blizzard struck like a beast unchained. One moment the world was still and heavy. The next the temperature plunged, the wind howled like something alive, and snow came in blinding sheets that erased the earth. Within minutes, a man couldn't see his own outstretched hand. Pike's posse hit the timberline just as the storm reached full fury. Horses reared and cried, fighting the bits. Men cursed and yanked scarves up over numb faces. Bram, tied to his saddle horn, could barely make out Pike's shape through the white chaos. "Keep moving!" Pike bellowed, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. "Finish this tonight or we all swing." Back at the camp, women dragged children into the lodges, driving stakes, deeper cinching hides tight against the wind that clawed at everything. Men scrambled to hold panicked horses that rolled their eyes and fought their ropes. Iron Wolf moved through the blinding snow, ushering the vulnerable into the cabin. Mara Keene, Sala. 3 small children, including a 4-year-old girl named Luma, with dark, shimmering eyes, old Graythorn, who could barely walk but refused to lie down and die, and Doc Avery, who had ridden out earlier with a warning and a rifle slung across her back. Iron Wolf dropped the wooden bar across the door. The stove glowed red, barely keeping the cold from crushing inward. Frost was already forming on the inside of the door in delicate, lethal swirls. Everyone huddled close breaths, fogging the dim cabin. Through the roar of the storm came other sounds, shouts, the clatter of metal, a horse screaming, and then the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle. A bullet punched through the oiled paper window, ripping the frame apart. Another shot followed, then another, slamming into the log walls, shaking the cabin. Splinters flew. Little Luma shrieked, her voice high with terror, and Sala clamped a hand over her mouth, whispering fiercely in Apache for her to be brave, to be still. Iron Wolf and Sala flipped the rough-hewn table, dragging it to the blown-out window. They jammed it into place and shoved their rifle barrels through the gap beneath. Iron Wolf fired blind into the storm muzzle flash, lighting the cabin in a brief, violent bursts. Sala worked her Springfield with steady, grim resolve. Efficiency guided Sala's hands as she snapped spent shells from her rifle and fed in new ones, steady despite the shaking walls. Outside, a horse went down, screaming, its legs snapping in a hidden drift. Connie was thrown violently. The terrified animal rolled over his leg with its full weight. His cries were swallowed by the storm, lost in the hurricane of sound. Smoke began pushing back into the cabin as the wind forced ice down the crude chimney. Gray haze filled the room, stinging eyes and throats. "Everyone get down, Doc," Avery shouted, her voice cutting through the choking air. Mara Keene crawled toward the stove, her hands wrapped in wet cloth that steamed and burned. She and Iron Wolf moved together, shoulder to shoulder, breath matched like two souls who had learned survival through the same fire. They eased the stove door open just enough to vent the smoke without killing the flames that kept them alive. The metal pipe groaned as pressure shifted. Smoke roared upward, and a blast of freezing air knifed through every crack in the cabin, but at least they could breathe again. Outside, Varn Pike dragged Bram toward the blind side of the cabin, shoving a dented kerosene can at him and jamming a lantern into his trembling hands. Snow had crusted on Bram's eyebrows and jaw. "Soak the logs," Pike snarled, desperation twisting his face. "Light it. Smoke them out or burn them alive, I don't care which." Bram's hands shook so hard, the lantern rattled. He splashed kerosene across the frozen logs, the liquid turning to icy streaks almost instantly. He lifted the lantern, the flame flickering in the wind, and made a gesture away from dropping it, from turning the cabin into a pyre. Through the storm, through the walls and wind, he heard something, a child crying, and a woman's voice, Mara's voice, soft-speaking German, the language of his childhood, telling the little girl that everything would be all right, that she shouldn't be afraid. Bram froze, lantern half raised. Time stretched thin. He could drop the flame, save his own skin, watch the cabin burn, or refuse and die out here in the freezing dark, far from home. He chose. He hurled the lantern into a snowbank where it shattered in a flash of orange. The storm devoured instantly. Then he spun toward Pike, his thin frame straightening, despite cold and terror, and shouted with everything he had. "No, I won't burn children. I won't." Pike's face twisted, and he raised his revolver. The shot cracked wide, lost in the white chaos. Bram did not run. He stood firm and began yelling warnings in both German and English, calling out positions, directions, anything that might help the people inside survive. Iron Wolf heard the shouts. He slipped through a narrow gap at the cabin's rear, dropping into snow, up to his thighs, circling through the whiteout with the silent precision of a hunter born to the wilderness. He spotted Pike, a dark smear against the storm, and hit him from the side just as Pike fired again. The shot vanished into the wind. They crashed into the drifts, rolling, wrestling, each struggling to breathe, as the snow tried to smother them both. At the front of the cabin, Rudd, Malloy, and Bolt slammed their shoulders into the door, trying to break through. Each impact knocked Mara backward, her boots sliding on the packed earth. She braced her back against the wood, arms trembling. The force of two grown men was too much. The timbers groaned, the leather hinges stretched. "Hold the door," Sala shouted, still firing through the gap. "I'm trying." Mara gasped, feeling every blow shudder through her bones, as if each strike might splinter more than just the wood. Bolt, drunk on rage and whiskey, slipped on hidden ice. His boot twisted at an ugly angle. A wet crack sounded audible even over the storm. He dropped screaming, clutching his shattered ankle. The sound high and animal. Rudd Malloy suddenly alone. Rudd Malloy hurled himself at the door one last time, putting every pound of his bulk behind it. The wood shuddered so violently, it seemed ready to tear free, but it held. He staggered back, breath ragged blood, running from a gash on his forehead, where the doorframe had caught him. The crimson streak mixed with the snow, sliding down his face. Behind the cabin, Varn Pike wrenched free of Iron Wolf's grip and dove for his revolver, half buried in the drift. His fingers closed around the cold steel. He came up gasping, swinging the weapon toward Iron Wolf's chest at point-blank range. Bram saw it happen. Time stretched thin, slow as pulling taffy. He saw the gun coming up, saw Pike's finger curling on the trigger, saw Iron Wolf off balance, exposed, unable to react in time. And in that frozen instant, Bram understood clearer than anything in his life that he had one chance to do something right. Something that meant more than fear or survival. He threw himself into the space between the barrel and the man he admired, straight into death's path. The revolver roared, the sound flat and suffocated by snow. The bullet slammed into Bram high in the chest, just under the left collarbone, angling down. The force spun him halfway round and sent him crashing into the drift. He landed on his back, staring up at a swirling white sky. Snowflakes drifted toward his face like falling stars. Blood soaked through his coat in a dark spread, steaming in the cold, turning the snow beneath him to pink slush. Iron Wolf lunged, driving his fist into Pike's jaw with every ounce of fury inside him. Pike's head snapped back, eyes rolling up as he dropped into the snow unconscious before he hit the ground. Iron Wolf dropped to his knees, beside Bram's hands, hovering over the wound, though he already knew this was mortal. "You fool!" "Why," he rasped. Bram coughed wetly, blood streaking his lips. "Couldn't let him shoot you," he whispered. "Couldn't burn children." His fading eyes found Iron Wolf's face. "Tell Mara I tried to be good." "You are good," Iron Wolf said, voice shaking. "Better than any of us." But Bram no longer heard him. His gaze fixed on something far beyond, something only he could see. His chest rose once shallow, trembling, and then fell still. Snowflakes settled on his open eyes, melting on the last warmth he carried. At the front of the cabin, Cutter Joe saw Pike collapse, and Bram drop beside him. His nerves shattered. He fled into the storm, swallowed by the blizzard like a ghost losing form. But the battle was far from done. A young Apache warrior named Connie, barely 17 winters old, had been circling the cabin's far side, hoping to flank the attackers. He was Sala's nephew, the son of her younger brother, gone to smallpox 5 years past. She had helped raise him, taught him to track and hunt, braided his hair when he was a child. He stepped from behind the woodpile just as Rafe Thorne, cold as iron, even amid the chaos, lifted his rifle with the ease of long practice. Rafe saw movement, just a shape in the storm, and fired without pause, without conscience, without a flicker of humanity. The bullet tore into Connie's throat, ripping through flesh and artery. The boy crumpled both hands, flying to the wound as blood pulsed between his fingers in hard rhythmic bursts that matched the frantic beat of a dying heart. His eyes widened, shocked, confused, unable to grasp how fast life had been taken from him. Sala saw him fall. She screamed his name, Connie, a sound raw, primal, ripped from the deepest place in her soul. The scream of a mother losing a son, not by birth, but by love. She burst through the cabin door, rifle still in hand, running through snow that dragged at her feet when she most needed speed. Rafe Thorne was already reloading, calm, methodical, machine-steady. He raised the rifle again, tracking the running woman, calculating the distance, the lead, the kill. Doc Avery saw it from the window. She snatched her medical bag and bolted outside, shouting with the authority of someone who had battled death for decades. "Get down!" Sala reached Connie and threw herself over him, shielding his body with her own. Her hands pressed desperately against the wound, though she could feel life pulsing out between her fingers, warm and slipping away. Rafe Thorne's rifle cracked. The bullet meant to tear through Sala's skull struck her high in the shoulder, instead spinning her sideways. She collapsed across Connie, her blood spilling warm against his red over red, staining the white snow beneath them. Doc Avery reached them seconds later, dropping to her knees in the crimson slush. "Don't move!" she shouted already, forcing her hands against Connie's throat. But blood surged between her fingers in terrible rhythmic bursts, hot, slick, unstoppable. She knew instantly with the cold certainty of someone who had watched death take too many that the bullet had severed the carotid artery. The boy's eyes were already losing their anchor, gazing past her at the storm-dark sky. "Stay with me," Doc Avery commanded, pushing harder, as if raw will could hold his life in place. "Connie, stay with me." But his lips were turning blue. His chest rose once, twice, each breath shallower than the last. His hands slipped from the wound and fell limp into the snow. The light faded from his eyes, like a candle smothered by wind there, one heartbeat gone the next. A boy with a future stolen, dreams unfulfilled, life undone before it ever had the chance to unfold. The blood stopped pulsing. His body went still. "No," Sala whispered, her voice splintering. "No, no, no." Rafe Thorne chambered another round, lifting his rifle to finish Doc Avery from behind. Iron Wolf saw it, saw the gleam of steel, the shift of intent, and snatched up Varn Pike's dropped revolver. He leveled it with both hands, fired through, driving snow through tears, through fury. The bullet kicked up snow 2 feet from Rafe Thorne. He fired again. The shot whistled past Rafe's head, close enough to make him flinch. Rafe Thorne made his calculation in that split second, the cold arithmetic of survival that had guided his life. Pike was down. Rudd Malloy was bleeding and useless. The job was ruined. But a man like Rafe Thorne never walked away empty-handed. He swung his rifle toward Rudd Malloy, who was staggering toward the horses, one hand clamped to the wound on his forehead. "Sorry, old man," Rafe muttered without a drop of feeling. "Nothing personal. Just business." He fired. The bullet punched straight through Malloy's back, tearing through lung and chest in a spray of blood. Rudd Malloy pitched forward into the snow, gasping like a fish hauled onto a riverbank. Each breath rattled wet and drowning. Blood steamed beneath him in a widening pool. Rafe Thorne ran to the dying man and knelt, rifling through Malloy's coat with practiced precision. He found a folded packet, the duplicate records Malloy had kept as leverage, against Pike, and the heavy leather pouch on the belt, coins clinking with the promise of escape. Rafe stuffed both into his own coat, seized Malloy's horse, and swung into the saddle. He looked back once at the bloody chaos. Bodies smoke-shattered snow and felt absolutely nothing. Then he kicked the horse hard and vanished into the storm, swallowed by white wilderness, as if he'd never lived at all. By the time anyone thought of giving chase, he was long gone. When dawn pressed through the thinning storm, the world lay silent except for the creak of settling snow and the harsh caw of a distant crow. The Apache camp was battered but not broken. Bodies lay covered in blankets and frost. Connie was dead, the artery torn straight through his life, poured out in less than a minute, his blood painting the snow a brutal crimson. They found him with Sala still draped over him, her face buried against his shoulder, sobbing without sound. Sala, shot through the shoulder, had survived only because Doc Avery packed the wound and tied it off before blood loss claimed her too. She would live, but she would carry that scar and that grief forever. A piece of her died beside Connie in the snow, and no one missed it in her eyes. Nearby they found Bram behind the cabin, his face pale as candle wax, peaceful in death. Doc Avery had done all she could, but the boy had given his life long before she ever reached him. Doc Avery worked quickly, digging out the bullet, packing the wound, and giving Bram laudanum for the pain, but the slug had nicked something vital deep inside. He had been bleeding internally, drowning slowly in his own blood. From the start, she had known he would not survive the day. Mara Keene knelt beside him as gray dawn light filtered through thinning clouds, holding his cold hand in both of hers. She spoke softly in German, her voice cracking with frozen tears on her cheeks. "You were brave. You saved us all. You are a hero. Your mother would be proud," she whispered. Bram had died just before noon, his hand held by Mara. Her words the language of home and memory. Sala, wounded, but refusing rest, stood nearby, head bowed in solemn respect for a boy who had chosen honor over life. Iron Wolf, too, bore injuries. In the fight with Pike, he had taken a glancing blow to the head, opening a gash above his left eye. Pike's boot had slammed into his ribs, cracking at least 2. He moved carefully, shallow breaths, reminding him of every fracture, but there was no time to rest. The dead needed tending, the living needed shelter, and reckoning still waited. That afternoon, they buried Bram in the frozen ground at the camp's edge. Iron Wolf, with flint and hollow, dug the grave through frost-hardened earth, inch by agonizing inch. It took 4 hours. Doc Avery recited a short prayer in English voice, steady and clear. "Lord, receive this young man who gave his life for others. He was braver than most men, twice his age, and kinder than this world deserved. May he rest in peace." It was honest, and it was more than most men received. They placed Connie's body on a burial scaffold in the cottonwoods, wrapped in the finest buffalo hide left painted with red ochre and tied with leather cords, so the wind and sky could carry his spirit home to his ancestors. Sala stood beneath the platform, one hand pressed to her wounded shoulder, staring at the bundle that held what remained of the boy she had loved like a son. Outside, Rudd Malloy lay face down where he had fallen dead from Rafe Thorne's bullet, his blood long frozen in the snow. Bolt ankles shattered, moaned nearby, delirious with cold and pain. Pike lay unconscious, wrists bound with rawhide, a swelling lump on his jaw, the size of a hen's egg, dark as a bruise. In the days that followed January 20th through month's end, Willow Springs struggled to dig itself out from under 2 feet of snow. The Apache mourned with proper rites, songs, silence, grief, given its full weight. Doc Avery tended the wounded, accepting no complaints, no excuses, no payment from those who could not afford it. On January 23rd, she retrieved the ledger and marriage papers from their hiding place in her clinic, tucked inside a hollowed medical text on a shelf where no one would think to look. She spent 3 nights by lamplight, copying the most damning entries, dates, names, forged signatures, stolen amounts, copying the marriage certificate and homestead patent word for word. Then she wrote a detailed letter to Judge Sterling in Tombstone Ridge, a man who owed her from a surgery performed 3 years earlier, and sent it via trusted courier, willing to ride through winter for triple pay. She also sent a telegraph alerting that witness testimony was available. The message reached Tombstone Ridge on January 25th. Judge Sterling, a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, read Doc Avery's letter and dispatched 2 federal marshals, Marshal Huxley and Deputy Rook, to Willow Springs, with orders to investigate and arrest. They arrived February 10th, 3 weeks after the blizzard riding horses, with ice crusted in their manes. They held preliminary hearings in the Lucky Dollar Saloon, the only space large enough to accommodate everyone who wanted to watch justice, or something like it, being served. On the morning of February 12th, Mara Keene testified first. Her voice was rough but steady, her English accent clear. She described nights in Rudd Malloy's barn, listening through cracks in the wall as 3 men divided stolen goods and argued. Mara Keene repeated word for word what Rudd Malloy had boasted, that the ledger was his life insurance against Pike, a bullet in his back. Doc Avery presented the ledger itself alongside her meticulous notes detailing discrepancies between government shipment records and actual deliveries, hundreds of pounds of flour, beef blankets and medicine, all paid for, all supposedly delivered. All gone. She produced the marriage certificate dated March 14th, 1877, and the homestead patent dated April 2nd, 1877, proving Mara's legal claim. Sala, arm in a sling face, carved from stone, testified about receiving short rations for 2 long years, spoiled food, threadbare blankets, and watching children go hungry while white men grew fat. Graythorne testified about broken promises, treaties signed and forgotten, being told to be grateful for scraps. Iron Wolf recounted the attack, Pike's threats, Bram's sacrifice, and Connie's murder. Marshall Huxley, a man seasoned by frontier corruption enough to fill a courthouse, issued arrest warrants immediately. Pike and Bolt were shackled and transported to Tombstone Ridge under armed guard. Warrants were issued for Mercer and Rafe Thorne, both vanished like morning mist. The trial was held in late March 1878, as snow finally melted and the first green shoots pierced the black earth. Varn Pike stood trial on charges of fraud, theft of government property, conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit murder. The ledger was entered as Exhibit A. Mara, Doc Avery, Sala, and Iron Wolf made the 3-day journey to Tombstone Ridge to testify again, their words recorded by a court stenographer struggling to keep pace. The jury, 12 men, ranging from shopkeepers to ranchers, deliberated 4 hours. Pike was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the Wyoming Territorial prison at Laramie, a grim stone fortress where the wind never ceased, and winters punished men who thought themselves tough. Bolt, convicted as an accessory, received 8 years in the same prison. Rudd Malloy, already dead and frozen in the ground, was posthumously convicted, symbolic justice, but one that mattered to those he had wronged. His estate, such as it was liquidated to pay partial restitution. Mercer was never caught, rumored to have moved from San Francisco to Denver, and then vanished entirely. The warrant remained active for 20 years before officially closing. Rafe Thorne disappeared into the territories with Rudd Malloy's blood money, never seen again. Some said he died in a gunfight outside Dodge City. Others swore they saw him years later in Deadwood, older, meaner, still carrying 2 guns. Truth like him died somewhere along the trail. By early April, spring transformed the prairie from white to gold to green. Ice broke on the river with cannon-like echoes. Massive sheets grinding, piling in frozen chaos until the current finally swept them away. Green grass pushed through black soil. Wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, and prairie roses bloomed. The air smelled of wet earth growth and possibility. On the morning of April 18th, Nolan Pruitt, a clerk from the Territorial Land Office, arrived at the camp on a nervous bay mare, leather satchel in hand. Young, perhaps 25, his fingers, ink-stained spectacles sliding down his nose. "Miss Mara Keene," he said, dismounting carefully. Mara stepped forward. Iron Wolf moved cautiously beside her, still mindful of his healing ribs. "Yes," Mara prompted. Pruitt adjusted his spectacles, clearing his throat. "The Territorial Office has completed its review of your case. The proxy marriage between you and Elias Bauer, executed March 14, 1877 in Hamburg, Germany, and registered with the United States Consulate, is verified as legal and binding. The homestead patent dated April 2, 1877, lists both you and Elias Bauer as joint owners under the Homestead Act of 1862. As surviving spouse, you are now the legal owner of 160 acres along Willow Creek, including riparian and mineral rights, and all structures thereon." Nolan Pruitt handed Mara Keene a thick envelope, its weight promising significance. Inside were the marriage certificate, the homestead patent, and an official confirmation letter stamped with the territorial seal. Mara stared at the documents as though they might vanish if she looked away, tears blurring her vision. Doc Avery, who had prepared everything meticulously for the occasion, stepped forward. She explained clearly in both English and German. The land is yours every inch, 160 acres. No one can take it from you, not the railroad, not the territory, not anyone. Pruitt shifted awkwardly, discomfort plain on his face. I should inform you, he said, that several railroad surveyors and land speculators have already expressed interest in purchasing this property. The sums discussed, substantial, upwards of $3,000. $3,000. Enough to return east, start anew somewhere civilized. Somewhere without snow, without bullets, without grief. Mara looked from the papers to Iron Wolf. She thought of the long winter, the smoke, the cold, the nights spent fixing the stove together, shoulders pressed tight in desperate synchrony. She remembered Sala teaching her to scrape hides to bank a fire to survive. She remembered Graythorn sharing his last jerky without asking. She remembered Bram throwing himself between Iron Wolf and Pike's gun, his final words asking her to tell his mother he had tried to be good. She remembered young Connie bleeding out in the snow and Sala's silent broken weeping. I do not want to sell, she said clearly, her voice steady. Pruitt blinked rapidly. Pardon, I do not want to sell this land. I want it in writing properly recorded. Mara continued glancing at Doc Avery, who nodded encouragingly. The deed stays in my name, but there will be a written covenant stating that Iron Wolf's band may use this cabin and meadow as winter shelter and trading ground. No sale, no lease. No alteration without notice to the band, elders and their consent. Witnessed in town. Plain lawful recorded. So no man can claim ignorance. Pruitt looked bewildered, mouth opening and closing like a fish. Miss Keene, with all due respect, you could sell this property for enough to live comfortably for years. You could return east. You could... I know, Mara interrupted quietly. But money is not everything. This land was meant for a family. I found my family here. This is where I stay. Judge Sterling, who had traveled from Tombstone Ridge to oversee the final resolutions and ensure justice, reviewed the covenant drafted by Doc Avery and a territorial lawyer over the next 2 days. He approved it with his signature and seal, ordering it filed with the county recorder and noted in the territorial court records. On April 18, 1878, the papers were signed and witnessed by Doc Avery and Marshall Huxley. The cabin and meadow remained in Mara's name, but the agreement made the band's right of use unmistakable. No alteration could occur without a fresh filing and the elders' consent. In the weeks that followed, as spring transformed the prairie from green to gold, and the river ran clear and fast, Iron Wolf and Mara worked side by side. They reinforced the cabin's foundation with river stones. He lifted the heavy rocks while she packed gaps with clay mixed with prairie grass. When a wagon arrived in late May with a proper cast iron stove and pipe paid for by the town council following Judge Sterling's pointed remarks on civic duty and moral responsibility, Iron Wolf instinctively positioned himself between Mara and the wagon's mud splash. She reached around him to steady a shifting crate, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. The touch was as natural as breathing. They did not speak of love in the flowery language of novels that occasionally drifted west. Their bond was written in shared work and survival, calloused hands and knowing glances. Iron Wolf learned to stand on her weaker hearing side in crowds, to speak clearly and face her when the words mattered. Mara learned to tap his arm twice, before someone approached from behind, giving him time to prepare. From private man to public warrior, Iron Wolf had learned to read every tilt of Mara Keene's head when she struggled to follow English conversations. He could sense the tension in her shoulders when he needed someone at his back, rather than looming in his face. One evening in mid-May, after a day of heavy work that had aggravated his healing ribs, Doc Avery came to check on him. She unwrapped the bandages with hands both efficient and gentle, inspecting the purple and yellow bruises that still patterned his side. "You're lucky," she said, rewrapping his ribs with fresh linen. "Another inch to the left, that kick would have punctured your lung. You'd have drowned in your own blood in 3 minutes. Not a way anyone should go. I've been lucky before, Iron Wolf murmured quietly, watching Mara through the small garden they had started. Luck runs out, Doc Avery said, tying off the bandage with a firm knot. But stubbornness, she thought, that lasts. Her gaze followed his to Mara. You two have something rare, she said softly. Something most people spend a lifetime seeking and never find. Don't waste it trying to be something you are not. Just be. Mara lifted her eyes from mending by the stove to meet Doc Avery's across the room. Iron Wolf said nothing, but understanding passed silently between all three, recognition that some bonds cannot be named or categorized, only lived. Graythorn, the old hunter with gnarled hands and sharp eyes, pulled Iron Wolf aside one pre-dawn morning. They watched the sun break over the eastern horizon, painting the prairie in rose and gold. You took a great risk for her, Graythorn said in Apache, his weathered face thoughtful. Some in the camp say you put white concerns above your people, that you brought danger for a woman who is not even one of us. I put truth above lies, Iron Wolf replied, voice firm. Justice above theft. The fight was never just about her, it was about all of us, about whether we would let them take everything, piece by piece, or stand and say enough. Graythorn was silent for a long moment, watching the light spill across the land, then nodded slowly. Your father would be proud. You have his courage and his wisdom. Do not doubt yourself, Connie. The formal term, acknowledging Iron Wolf's place, worthiness, and belonging. Those words stayed with him through trial healing and the long days of rebuilding. Now on a warm June evening, with sun setting and bands of gold crimson and deep purple, he and Mara stood on the new porch they had built together, overlooking the meadow where Apache children played and horses grazed. The air smelled of wild roses and sage. The river sang its endless song. Iron Wolf's hand rested on the smooth pine rail, still fragrant with fresh wood. Mara's hand, scarred but strong, rested beside it, fingers not quite touching, close enough to feel warmth. You could have left, Iron Wolf said quietly, watching the fading light. Sold the land, gone back east, started anew. Somewhere, no one knew your story. I could have, Mara agreed, watching the children play a leather ball game, laughter spilling into the meadow. But I did not want to. I do not want to. This is where I belong now. This is home. He looked at her, truly looked the way a man looks at something precious, hard-won. He saw not the frightened girl, bought for $1, and freed the same day, but a woman who had survived, emerged, stronger, fiercer, more alive than most ever managed. Yes, he said simply. She looked back, recognition in her eyes. He was no longer just the warrior who had torn a contract in the snow. He was the man she trusted with her life. His quiet strength had given her freedom to choose her path, and she had chosen it, still choosing, will choose tomorrow and the day after. They stood in the fading light as the first stars pierced the darkening sky, not quite touching, bound together by something deeper and more permanent than words, by survival, by choice, by the unshakable reality of two people who had decided to stand together when the world demanded courage. The world tried its hardest to tear them apart. Sala recovered slowly from her shoulder wound, the scar puckered and stubborn aching whenever storms rolled in. But the wound to her spirit took far longer to heal. She found work in town. Her skill with hides earned grudging respect from men who had once ignored her. She and Doc Avery became unlikely allies, fierce women, bound by loss, refusing to be diminished. They met once a week for coffee at the clinic, speaking little, but understanding much, each word heavy with the unspoken pain of Connie's death. She channeled her grief into protecting other children, ensuring none would perish from stolen medicine or missing supplies. Sala became the band's voice in town, the woman who could march into the agency office or the general store and demand accountability. Men learned quickly not to lie to her face. Doc Avery remained in Willow Springs for the rest of her days. Her clinic was always busy, always open. Her reputation stretched far beyond the territory. She delivered babies, white Apache, Mexican Chinese. Set broken bones, treated fevers, performed surgeries on kitchen tables if necessary, and never turned away a patient in genuine need. When she died in her sleep on a spring morning in 1901 at age 68, half the territory attended her funeral. A line of people stretched a quarter-mile standing by her grave to say thank you. Bram was buried in the small cemetery outside town, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross carved by Iron Wolf himself. He had burned the words into the wood with a hot iron, Bram, 1858-1878. Brave. Mara Keene visited the grave every spring, placing wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, and prairie roses that grew wild on the land he had died to protect. She spoke to him in German, thanking him for his courage, and telling him about the children who played in the meadow, because he had refused to fire that lantern. Rafe Thorne was never found. Rumors sent him to California, then the Black Hills, then Montana, then nowhere at all. Some said he died in a gunfight outside Dodge City in 1882. Others swore they saw him years later in Deadwood. Older, meaner, carrying the same 2 guns, the same dead eyes, working as an enforcer for a cattle baron, with more money than morals. The law eventually stopped looking. Rafe Thorne vanished like smoke blood, money in his pockets swallowed by the frontier like countless men before him. The frontier remained brutal. More railroads carved the prairie into parcels. More treaties were broken, more land stolen, more people displaced. Winters tested everyone, separating the stubborn from the sensible, the survivors from the dreamers. But on this patch of land, a cabin on treaty ground, a meadow held in trust, 160 acres, where 2 different worlds collided somehow against all odds, they had chosen not to destroy each other. An Apache warrior and a German immigrant woman had built something that could not be measured in dollars or acres. They had built a refuge, a family, a bond forged not in romance or poetry, but in the unshakable reality of 2 people who chose to stand together when the world tried to tear them apart. They fixed a stove together on the coldest winter night. They survived because they refused to do anything else. In the brutal arithmetic of the frontier in 1878, that was a victory worth more than all the gold in California. Years later, when people asked Mara Keene, and they always asked as the story spread and grew, how she and Iron Wolf had come together, she would smile quietly and say simply, "He bought me for $1 and tore up the contract. Everything after that, we built together." And that was the truth, plain and unadorned. The way truth always is, when you scrape away everything else and look at what remains: 2 people, a harsh land, and a choice to build rather than break. The rest was just living. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover, visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.